Now if you've seen the first part of this two-part series, you'll know that I began by looking at wills that were made by two of my 7 times great grandfathers. One of them dates from 1763 and the other from 1818. Basically the beginning and the end of the reign of George III. In the interests of equality, I think it's only fair that we demonstrate that women made wills as well as men. So I have found amongst my research 2 really interesting wills made by ladies. But the ladies who inspired this video weren't alive in the 1760s, they were around in the 1660s. What can these ladies tell us? So let's look at my 8 times great grandmother, Anne Hesketh, later Aspinwall. I don't know when she was born, but I do know that she married Henry Aspinwall on the 17th of January 1676 at Halsall near Ormskirk, and that she had 9 children over the next 20 years. 7 of them survived her. Henry had been described as a yeoman in 1677 and 1702 on various land-based documents, but by the time he died he was actually sufficiently well off to be a gentleman. And Anne outlived this gentleman by 27 years. So we may not know exactly when she was born, but suppose she got married at 16, she apparently lived to be 76 and could well have been older. We're looking at somebody who was probably born during Oliver Cromwell's Commonwealth period. That's quite a thing to think about. So Anne's will is dated May 1735, a good 15 months before she was buried. So what does it tell us about her as a person? First, she's a widow. She's living at Altker, which is near Ormskirk, near Southport, in the middle of the two. She says she is of sound and perfect memory. She's in her right mind, essentially. And like many people who made wills, Anne left quite specific instructions about where she wanted to be buried, but she put them right at the beginning of the document. Effectively, that was your funeral directions. She was also, like many people, very conscious of the fact that she was departing this mortal life, and specifically says that she hopes for a joyful reception into eternal bliss and happiness. She wants to go to heaven, but then she moves on to more tangible concerns. This is when we start to learn more about her family. At various points Anne mentions her sons William, Thomas and John. She mentions 2 daughters-in-law, Elizabeth and Abigail. There's a daughter, Mary Parr, so we instantly know that her daughter Mary, actually her youngest daughter, then about 45 years old, was still alive and also married to Mr. Parr. Anne's son John had apparently had 4 sons of his own, to which Anne leaves a shilling apiece, which doesn't sound like a lot of money, but in our modern terms it's the equivalent of about £140. But one of John's sons in particular, John Jr., is singled out. Anne says that she is leaving him 1 standing bed, a feather bed and bolster, and 2 chairs from her own bedroom. Essentially, she's leaving her bedroom furniture to her grandson. I suppose it's a sort of a memento. By 1735, Anne had quite a few grandchildren. She specifically mentions Henry, who is the son of her son Thomas. We can deduce quite quickly that Henry must have been born after about 1714, because she puts this clause in that says that if Henry lives to be 21, he is entitled to have all the large standing goods, the dresser and pewter, tables, settle, another word for a sofa, and clock, also a great table in the parlour, so clearly he is underage at the time. Of course, not everybody could expect to live to be an adult in the 1730s, many people didn't get past childhood. Anne even allows for this situation in her will. If that grandson Henry didn't make it to 21, then his share would simply go to his father Thomas's next eldest surviving child. That's quite a normal thing to do, just pass it down the family and it gets distributed so that a smaller audience gets a bigger share. And if none of Thomas's children live to adulthood, then the parlour furniture simply goes to Henry's aunt, Mary Parr, mentioned earlier. It just gets passed down and down so that somebody gets it. By the time Anne made her will, her eldest son Edward had already died, some 9 or 10 years earlier, so she couldn't leave anything to him, but she could look after his widow Elizabeth. Anne never explicitly says that Elizabeth had been married to Edward, but wills often include loads of useful details that mean that you can piece together a family group. You just got to go backwards and forwards a bit. Anne leaves to her daughter-in-law's children, viz. Henry, Thomas and Elizabeth Aspinwall, the sum of £10, and then she talks about the remainder of that money now in my daughter-in-law Elizabeth Aspinwall's hands. So all I've got to do is find out when those children, Henry, Thomas and Elizabeth, were baptised, find out who the father or mother was according to the record, and then I can work out which of Anne's children they descend from. And of course it was Edward. Just as we often do today, our ancestors generally nominated at least 2 executors, sometimes 3 or more, to keep things balanced, to make sure that their last will and testament, their last wishes, were carried out exactly as they wanted them. And Anne reinforces the fact that she is trusting her executors to do this immediately after she names them. They're her son Thomas Aspinwall and her son Henry Parr of Liverpool, so now we know that her daughter Mary is probably living in Liverpool. Sure enough, I find a marriage between Mary Aspinwall and Henry Parr in June 1712 at St Nicholas's Church in Liverpool, so that does confirm those little clues that Anne left in her will. It all ties the family together with proper historical records. One final detail is that Anne did not sign the document as such. She marked it with what looks like a capital A. Now, whether that was the only letter that she could write, whether she was basically illiterate, or whether it was just that she started a signature and through old age or infirmity her eyes or her hands were just too weak for her to finish it, is something we can only guess at, but it adds another dimension to what we know about her through her will. Now, researching things isn't something that you put together overnight. Talks are not things that you put together overnight. They take a lot of work and they often evolve, a bit like the research that has gone into this video. In September 2019, I was actually working on a completely other project about Catholic people living in the Ormskirk area in the 17th century, and that led me on to another very interesting testatrix. Her name is Jane Tipping, and she was one of only 19 people to be named in the recusant rolls of 1641, so we're going right back to, this is actually the year before the English Civil War breaks out. If you are looking for people who weren't necessarily Anglican, things like recusant records are really, really useful. They weren't all necessarily Catholic. Sometimes they might also be Quakers or Presbyterians, or basically people who were obviously not attending Anglican Church, as the law said they should. And for this misdemeanour, Jane Tipping is fined the princely sum of 16 pence. But time moves on. At some point between 1648 and 1666, again it's round about the English Civil War time, church records are patchy, Jane's husband George dies. Jane, however, lived on into the reign of Charles II, and we know that she was buried at Ormskirk Church on the 1st of May 1666, just a few months before the Great Fire of London. And her will begins quite differently to Anne Aspinwall's, but it follows another fairly typical convention. She describes the date in relation to the time that the reigning monarch has been on the throne. It's a bit unusual, but quite typical of its time. did you notice something strange? Charles II was proclaimed king in 1660. So how exactly has he been on the throne for 18 years in 1666? It doesn't add up, does it? Well, there's a link to that in the first part of this video. As loyal monarchists often overlook the Commonwealth period, they backdated the start of Charles II's reign to January 1649, when his father, Charles I, had his head chopped off. So by that calculation, May 1666 would indeed technically be the 18th year of the reign of Charles II. Now we've cleared the date up, Jane is going to confirm who she is. I, Jane Tipping, of Ormskirk within the county of Lancaster, widow, relict, and late wife of George Tipping, late of Ormskirk, aforesaid, gentleman deceased. So it's definitely the same woman from the recusants list. We've got the right address, we know that she's the widow of George Tipping. Like Anne Aspinwall, she commends my soul into the hands of Almighty God, my Creator, hoping through the merits of Jesus Christ, the Saviour of the world, to obtain full pardon and remission of all my sins, and to be made partaker of everlasting bliss and glory. It sounds a bit over the top, doesn't it? Expressions of religious devotion on this level are really common in wills. People are on their deathbed or close to it. Of course, they're going to be thinking about what comes next. And later in the document, Jane also directs that her funeral expenses should be taken out of whatever her estate is worth before anything else is dispersed. But Jane is a woman of substance. She's the widow of a gentleman, and she has got material possessions that need to be disposed of. From her understanding how people lived in 1666, Jane Tipping's will is incredible. At this point, she lives at a messuage, burgage and tenement in Orton Street. That's one of the main streets in Ormskirk town centre. And this property includes folds, fronts, I think that's land facing the main street, backsides, land presumably behind the house, outhousing, 17th century shed, garden and orchard. Quite a substantial property. But on the other hand, a garden and an orchard would be pretty essential to provide fruit and vegetables, so in that sense it would be a reasonable thing to expect from any decent family home. People did grow their own fruit and veg in those days. And all of this property went to her daughter Alice, who was unmarried. She'd recently acquired new closes or new enclosures in nearby Bickerstaff, and Alice was entitled to take custody of these until she had collected £140 worth of profits. I think what that basically means is she can rent them out until whoever the tenants are have paid £140 in rent money, or maybe by selling produce at market or some other option that would be available to her. Either way, she's going to make £140 out of this property. And after this, Alice's married sister Anne and her husband Euston Crewe are then entitled to have that same property. Euston, according to the will, is an apothecary from Wrexham in North Wales. Now if you cross the Mersey at Birkenhead, it's only 50 miles from Ormskirk to Wrexham. So there's quite a useful clue that Jane had family who had moved far beyond the immediate locality of Ormskirk, so that's quite a thing to think about for the 1660s. But Jane was determined to make sure that Alice got this £140. She put in this clause that if Anne and Euston did indeed want to move into this property sooner, absolutely yes they could, but they had to pay Alice the money that was due to her. Alice is not going to miss out. Another of the main streets in Ormskirk is Burscough Street. Jane Tipping mentions another property in her will on Burscough Street, another messuage, burgage and tenement, so the two are probably not too far away from each other, probably a short walk. Jane's already got a home of her own. She doesn't technically need another house, but she's got one. So what does? She rents it out. And the will even goes as far as to say that she had rented it out to the recently deceased John Withington, so at the time it must have been vacant. Since it was empty, she left it to another daughter, Mary, who we find out from the will was married to John Crewe, who is a maltster who was living in the same town of Ormskirk. From a family history point of view and creating of a family tree point of view, certainly Jane's will is proving to be very, very helpful. Financially, Jane was very, very on the ball. She didn't miss a thing, and she explicitly goes to the trouble in her will of stating that 3 local people owe her money. They are Thomas Moorcroft, innholder of Ormskirk, who owes her £92 and 8 shillings. That's a lot of money. Richard Howitt of Ormskirk, who owes her £10, and Elizabeth Whittam, a widow from Rufford, which is a few miles away, who owes her £20. She was also very, very explicit about the fact that they needed to pay up, because she needed £110 of that money to add to the £140 expected from that property and Bickerstaff. This is where wills tend to cross over with the information they mentioned previously and generally mess with your head a bit, because in total that would be £250, and that was the money that she wanted to go to her daughter Alice. At this point I said Alice is the only unmarried daughter, so it makes me think that perhaps her other sisters, Anne and Mary, had been given an equivalent sum of £250 as a dowry when they had married, in which case Alice Tipping would have been a very, very eligible unmarried young lady. Jane didn't itemise any specific possessions in her will. She just makes a general comment that her daughter Mary should inherit her other personal effects, with one exception. In 1667 there were 3 living generations of Jane's family. She mentions a granddaughter, Mary Crewe, but unfortunately Jane has got 2 married daughters, Anne and Mary, and both of them are married to men with the surname Crewe. I don't know whether Mary was Anne's daughter or whether she was Mary's daughter. There's an unanswered question. The final lines of the document are frankly difficult to read. I looked this up a long time ago in the Lancashire Archives, but it is possible to make out that Jane refers to a cousin, Arthur Boren, a gentleman from Warrington, and a brother-in-law, Henry Young of Riston, which I think might possibly be Rushton in Cheshire. But the confusing thing is that whatever purpose they served, they were definitely not the executors. That task fell to John and Euston Crewe. Sometimes history presents more questions than it answers. When you start to compare the relevant dates for Anne Aspinwall, née Hesketh, and Jane Tipping, formerly Gellibrand, you realise that Anne would have been a child when Jane Tipping died. They may have passed in the streets of Ormskirk on a market day, but perhaps not. Jane Tipping was a gentleman's wife and a Catholic. She probably had servants to go to market for her. Anne Hesketh seems to have been an Anglican, but she could have been born during the Commonwealth period when the laws about going to Anglican church were set aside. Her exact religious background is a matter of conjecture. Therefore, definitive records of their lives are just not that easy to find. Both documents provide absolutely fantastic evidence of the different family relationships that they would have enjoyed with other people, even if a little bit of further research is needed to confirm those links or work out exactly where marriages and baptisms did take place. But as an added bonus, when Jane Tipping died, her executors had to assess the value of her estate, And to do this, they drew up an inventory of her household goods. And as far as domestic history goes, inventories are worth a video all of their own. They tell you so much about what people actually had in their houses. My next project at some point is going to be to look at inventories, and we're going to see what unusual and exciting things are to be found in there. But in the meantime, if you have got a question or a comment about a historic will, do feel free to put the comment in the box. Let me know what you're wondering about these fascinating, strange and wonderful documents, because they are wonderful documents. Maybe we can get some ideas going and start a conversation. Thank you for listening to the video, hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully it will not be too long before I make another one.